The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked between a utility bill and a feed catalog. It demanded I cut my grass to 4 inches, paint my fence white, and remove the inoperable vehicle from my property. The letterhead read, Ridgewood Estates Homeowners Association. I had never heard of them. Comment below where you're watching from. Because what happened next still keeps me up at night. I checked my deed that same hour. My 40 acres had never been part of any subdivision. No covenants, no restrictions, no HOA. Yet here was a letter demanding compliance and threatening fines. I served 20 years in the Marine Corps. I survived 2 tours in Iraq. I did not survive all of that to let some suburban bureaucrat steal my land through paperwork. When they sent their enforcement team, I met them on my porch with a shotgun in my hands. That is when everything exploded. My name is Nathan Cole. I spent 20 years in the Marine Corps, retiring as a staff sergeant with 2 combat tours in Iraq and enough hard lessons to last a lifetime. When I finally hung up the uniform at 52, I knew exactly what I wanted: land, silence, and distance from anything resembling bureaucracy. I found all 3 in 40 acres of rural Texas, about an hour outside Austin. The property came with a farmhouse that needed work, a barn that needed more, and a view of open sky that made every sunrise feel earned. I paid cash from 2 decades of savings and combat pay. No mortgage, no debt, just my name on a deed and the freedom I had spent half my life fighting for. My German Shepherd Duke came with me, a retired military working dog who had seen as much action as I had. Together, we settled into a rhythm of early mornings, hard labor, and the kind of quiet that only comes from owning your piece of earth. The Remington 870 stayed in the gun safe by my bedroom door. Not because I expected trouble, but because a man who has seen what I have seen never stops preparing for it. Texas law was clear on property rights. Castle Doctrine meant I had every legal right to defend my land against trespassers using reasonable force. I hoped I would never need to exercise that right. But I kept the shotgun cleaned and loaded just the same. My closest neighbors were Earl and Betty Thompson, a couple in their 70s who had worked the adjacent property for 35 years. Earl measured words carefully and never wasted a single one. Betty made cornbread that could bring a grown man to tears. They stopped by the week I moved in, welcomed me to the area, and warned me about the summer heat over the following months. They became something close to family. Earl knew every fence line, every water source, every dispute that had ever touched this corner of the county. His knowledge would prove more valuable than I could have imagined. The trouble started 6 months after I settled in. Half a mile to the east, a subdivision called Ridgewood Estates had been growing steadily for the past 3 years. Cookie-cutter houses, manicured lawns, and the kind of homeowners association that believed its authority extended to the horizon. I had noticed the construction, but paid it no mind. My land was separate. We existed in different worlds. That assumption died the morning I opened that letter. I sat at my kitchen table, examining it closely. The demands were specific and absurd. Cut my grass to 4 inches. Paint my fence an approved white. Remove my old Ford pickup, classified as an inoperable vehicle, even though I drove it to town twice weekly. Failure to comply within 30 days would result in escalating fines and enforcement action. It was signed by Garrett Lawson, president of Ridgewood Estates, HOA. I had never met the man. I had never set foot in his subdivision. And I certainly had never agreed to any of his rules. I pulled my deed from the fireproof safe in my office. The document was unambiguous. I had purchased directly from a retired rancher who had held the property for 40 years. No covenants recorded, no deed restrictions, no mention of any homeowners association. My land predated Ridgewood Estates by decades. I was not a member. I was not subject to their authority. The letter was legally meaningless. A demand backed by nothing but arrogance. I drafted a response that evening. Polite, but firm. I explained that my property was not part of Ridgewood Estates, and that I would not comply with demands from an organization lacking jurisdiction over my land. I sent it certified mail the next morning and considered the matter closed. Earl stopped by that evening with a jar of Betty's pickled okra. We sat on my porch watching the sun drop toward the horizon. Duke sprawled at my feet. I mentioned the letter almost as an afterthought. Earl's expression changed immediately. "Garrett Lawson," he said quietly. "That man has been trying to expand his little kingdom for years. You're not the first landowner he's targeted." He told me about 2 families who had received similar letters. One paid fines just to make the harassment stop. The other sold their property and moved away. "He uses intimidation," Earl continued. "Counts on people not knowing the law. Counts on them being too tired or too scared to fight." He looked at me with something between warning and respect. "Something tells me you're not that type." Duke lifted his head suddenly, ears pricked toward the eastern tree line. A low growl rumbled in his throat. I followed his gaze but saw nothing in the fading light, just shadows and silence. But Duke had spent years detecting threats invisible to the human eye. I trusted his instincts more than my own vision. Someone was watching from Ridgewood's direction. I made a mental note to check my property boundaries in the morning. If Lawson wanted a fight, he would find one, but it would be fought on my terms, on land that belonged to me alone. 2 weeks after I sent my certified letter, the response arrived. Not a polite acknowledgement. A notice of violation printed on heavy cardstock with the Ridgewood Estates logo embossed in gold. $500 for failing to comply with Community Standards Sections 3 through 7. Due within 14 days. Failure to pay would result in property liens and escalated enforcement measures. Bold red ink at the bottom, this notice constitutes official legal documentation. I recognized the tactic immediately. Intimidation is designed to make people pay just to end the harassment. I filed the notice in a folder marked Evidence and went about my day. The first intrusion came 3 days later. I was in the barn replacing a rotted beam when Duke started barking with an intensity I recognized from our years together. Not a casual alert. The sharp, focused warning of a threat on our territory. I walked outside to find 2 men standing near my fence line, approximately 50 yards from the house, matching navy polo shirts with Ridgewood compliance embroidered on the chest. I photographed my property with a professional camera. The other wrote notes on a clipboard while staring at my old Ford pickup. Neither had knocked. Neither had announced itself. They had simply walked onto my land. I approached at a measured pace. Duke at my heel. His growl a low rumble that made both men freeze. The one with the clipboard stepped forward. Mid-30s, clean-shaven, confident posture. His name tag read Derek Simmons, compliance officer. He smiled with practiced professionalism. "Mr. Cole, we're documenting ongoing violations. This will only take a few minutes." I stopped 10 feet away. "You're trespassing. Leave." Simmons glanced at his colleague, then back at me. His smile remained fixed, but something flickered behind his eyes. A calculation. He knew exactly where my property lines were. He knew he was standing where he should not be. "Sir, our records indicate this parcel falls within Ridgewood jurisdiction. Everyone complies eventually. It's just easier that way." I pointed at the no trespassing sign on my fence post. 30 seconds to get off my land. After that. I called the sheriff. The photographer had already started backing toward the road, reading the situation more accurately than his partner. Simmons held my gaze, weighing options. Then his smile hardened. "You'll regret this. Mr. Cole, we'll be back with documentation you can't ignore." They walked to a white SUV on the county road and drove toward Ridgewood. I watched until they disappeared. Simmons had not argued jurisdiction. He had not produced any document proving his claims. He had simply threatened and retreated. That told me everything I needed to know about the legitimacy of his authority. That afternoon, I drove to Austin and purchased 4 weatherproof security cameras with motion detection and cloud storage. By nightfall, every approach to my property was under surveillance. The main entrance, the barn, the eastern fence line facing Ridgewood, the house and driveway. Whatever happened next would be documented beyond dispute. The following morning, I drove to the county clerk's office and requested certified copies of every document associated with my property: the deed, the original survey, any recorded covenants, easements, or restrictions. The clerk pulled the files within an hour. The results were unambiguous. My 40 acres had been carved from a larger ranch in 1952. Decades before Ridgewood Estates existed, no covenants had ever been recorded. No plat maps included my land within any subdivision boundaries. The HOA had no legal connection to my property whatsoever. Their claim was not a misunderstanding. It was a fabrication. I obtained certified copies and added them to my evidence folder. On the drive home, I called Earl. "Those other families Lawson went after," I said. "Were their properties actually part of Ridgewood?" Earl was quiet for a moment. "Margaret Dawson, about a mile north, widowed, 70s. She paid $2,000 before realizing they had no right to collect anything." He paused. "Robert Keller, small ranch to the south, paid $1,500 to make them leave him alone." Neither property was part of the subdivision. Lawson was not enforcing the rules. He was extracting money from people who did not know how to fight back. I returned home with a clearer picture of what I was facing: systematic fraud targeting vulnerable landowners outside any legal jurisdiction, but I needed more evidence. I walked my property line that afternoon, checking fence posts and boundary markers. Near the eastern edge, where my land approached Ridgewood territory, I found something that stopped me cold. 3 metal survey stakes marked the corner of my property, but they were in the wrong position. I had studied my original survey map closely enough to recognize the discrepancy immediately. These markers had been moved approximately 15 feet toward my property, shrinking my land on paper while expanding Ridgewood's claimed territory. Someone had physically altered official boundary markers to support fraudulent jurisdiction claims. The tampering was recent. The stakes showed fresh disturbance in the soil around them, probably within the last few months. I photographed everything with my phone, capturing the stakes from multiple angles with the fence line and tree positions as reference points. In Texas, tampering with survey markers was a 3rd-degree felony, punishable by up to 10 years in prison. This was not bureaucratic overreach. This was not aggressive HOA enforcement. This was criminal activity, deliberate and calculated. Lawson had altered physical evidence to steal land rights from his neighbors. He had built an extortion operation on forged boundaries and fake authority. I stood at the edge of my property, looking toward Ridgewood in the distance. The subdivision's neat houses and uniform lawns seemed almost peaceful in the afternoon light. But behind that facade was a predator who had been feeding on vulnerable people for years. Margaret Dawson, a widow in her 70s, was paying $2,000 she could not afford. Robert Keller, just trying to work his land in peace. Who knew how many others had been victimized without even realizing they had been defrauded? Lawson had made a serious mistake when he targeted me. I was not a widow, living alone. I was not a farmer too tired to fight. I was a Marine who had spent 20 years learning how to identify threats, gather intelligence, and neutralize enemies through superior tactics, and I had just found evidence that could send him to prison. The question now was how deep the corruption went, and how many more victims were waiting to be found. The surveyor arrived on Thursday morning. James Hartley was a licensed professional with 30 years of experience and a reputation for precision that extended across 3 counties. I had found him through the Texas Society of Professional Surveyors and verified his credentials before making contact. When I explained what I had discovered on my property line, his voice turned serious. "Tampering with survey markers is a third-degree felony," he said. "If someone moved those stakes, I'll find evidence of it, and I'll document everything in a way that holds up in court." He charged $400 for a full boundary survey. I considered it an investment. Hartley spent 6 hours on my property with his equipment, measuring angles, checking GPS coordinates, and comparing his findings against the original plat maps filed with the county in 1952. When he reached the eastern boundary where I had found the disturbed stakes, he stopped and examined the ground for a long time. He took photographs from multiple angles. He measured distances to fixed reference points like fence posts and mature trees that predated any development. By late afternoon, he had completed his assessment. We sat on my porch while he reviewed his findings. "Your property lines are exactly where the original survey placed them," he said, pointing to coordinates on his map. "But these 3 stakes have been moved approximately 15 feet to the west. The disturbance is recent, probably within the last 6 months, based on soil compaction and vegetation regrowth." He looked up at me. "Someone wanted it to appear that Ridgewood's territory extended onto your land." I asked if he could testify to these findings. Hartley nodded, without hesitation. "I'll provide a certified report with full documentation. What they did is not just tampering. It's attempted land theft." I paid him and added his report to my evidence file. The pieces were connecting, but I needed to understand the full scope of the operation. That meant talking to the other victims Earl had mentioned. Margaret Dawson lived in a modest farmhouse about a mile north. She was 73 years old, widowed for 8 years, and had worked the same 60 acres since her husband passed. When I knocked on her door and explained who I was, she invited me inside with the weary hospitality of someone who had stopped expecting good news. 2 years ago, she had started receiving letters from Ridgewood demanding compliance with community standards. She had paid over $2,000 before her grandson, visiting from Houston, examined her deed, and confirmed she had no connection to any HOA. "I'm not good with legal documents," she said quietly. "They kept threatening to put a lien on my house. I just wanted it to stop." I asked who she had paid. She retrieved a box of receipts. Every check had been made out to Garrett Lawson personally, not to Ridgewood Estates HOA. The money had gone directly into his pocket. I photographed each receipt and asked if she would provide a sworn statement. She agreed, her voice stronger now. "If you can stop him from doing this to anyone else, I'll do whatever you need." Robert Keller's story followed the same pattern. Small ranch to the south, letters demanding compliance, escalating fines, threats of property seizure. He had paid $1,500 over 18 months before a friend told him to check his deed. His checks were also made out to Lawson personally. "He preys on people who don't know better," Robert said, anger tightening his jaw. "Old folks, people living alone, anyone who looks like they won't fight back." He gave me copies of his receipts and agreed to provide a statement. Word travels fast in rural communities. Once Margaret and Robert started talking, others came forward. Over the following week, 5 additional landowners contacted me through Earl's network. Every one of them had received demands from Ridgewood. Every one of them had paid fines ranging from $300 to $4,000. The total across all 8 victims exceeded $23,000, all flowing into Lawson's personal accounts. This was organized theft, disguised as community governance. Then came the final notice. According to this document, my accumulated fines now total $1,500. Failure to pay within 7 days would result in immediate legal action, including property seizure. And the letter was signed by Victoria Cross, identified as legal counsel for Ridgewood Estates HOA. Her signature was confident. Her title was a lie. I spent an hour on the Texas State Bar website that evening. Victoria Cross did not appear in the attorney database. No law license, no registration, no record of ever having passed the bar exam. She was presenting herself as legal counsel while having no authority to practice law. In Texas, that was a Class A misdemeanor at minimum, potentially a felony, depending on how she had used the false credentials. The next morning, I called Bradley Morrison, a property law attorney in Austin whose name appeared on several favorable reviews for boundary disputes. I explained the situation in detail, the fabricated authority claims, the moved survey markers, the pattern of extortion across 8 victims, and the unlicensed individual signing threatening letters as legal counsel. Morrison listened without interruption. When I finished, there was a long pause. "Mr. Cole, what you're describing goes beyond civil fraud," he said carefully. "Tampering with survey markers is a felony. Collecting money under pretenses is theft by deception. Using fake legal credentials to threaten victims is aggravated fraud. And if Lawson is operating this scheme systematically across multiple victims over multiple years, we're looking at potential RICO violations." He paused. "You have enough here to involve the county district attorney and possibly the Texas Attorney General. But we need to build the case properly. Documentation, witness statements, and financial records. Everything organized and unassailable." I told him I had already started. He agreed to review my evidence file and advise on next steps, before hanging up. He offered one final observation. "These people have been operating with impunity because their victims didn't know how to fight. Lawson just made the mistake of targeting someone who does." I spent that evening organizing everything into a formal case file. Hartley's survey report, Margaret's receipts, Robert's checks, statements from all 8 victims, copies of every threatening letter, screenshots proving Victoria Cross had no law license. The certified documents from the county clerk establish my property boundaries. Each piece of evidence was dated, labeled, and cross-referenced. If this went to court, the prosecution would have everything they needed laid out in perfect order. Lawson had built his empire on the assumption that his victims were too scared, too confused, or too exhausted to fight back. He was about to learn what happened when he chose the wrong target. The cease and desist letter went out on Monday, printed on Bradley Morrison's legal letterhead and sent via certified mail. It informed Garrett Lawson that all demands for fines were fraudulent and warned that any further contact or trespassing would result in criminal complaints and civil litigation. Morrison's bar number was prominently displayed. There would be no more pretending that the Victoria Cross had legal authority. I also contacted the county sheriff's office to document the situation. Deputy Marcus Webb took my report, listening carefully as I described the harassment and extortion pattern. He was sympathetic, but honest. "Unless they commit a crime on your property that we can witness or document, our hands are tied. But if they come back, call me immediately." I told him my cameras were recording around the clock. He gave me his direct number. Saturday morning arrived clear and cold. I was in the kitchen before dawn, coffee in hand, watching the first gray light spread across the eastern sky. Duke lay near the door, relaxed but alert. The property was quiet. I had almost convinced myself that Morrison's letter had ended the matter. Then Duke's head snapped up. A low growl rumbled in his chest. He was on his feet before I heard anything at all. Engines, more than one, coming from the direction of the main road, through the window. I saw Simmons' white SUV turning onto my property. Behind it, a flatbed tow truck. They passed the no trespassing signs without slowing. 3 men, heading toward my old Ford pickup near the barn. They meant to seize my vehicle as enforcement of fines I did not owe. I walked to the gun safe, entered the combination, and retrieved the Remington 870. The weight was familiar. I checked the chamber, confirmed the safety was engaged, and moved to the front door. I stepped onto the porch with the shotgun held at low, ready, barrel pointed at the ground, finger outside the trigger guard. Duke stood beside me, muscles coiled. The tow truck had backed up to my Ford. One man was already examining the hitch points. Simmons emerged from the SUV with a confident stride. He saw me on the porch and stopped. His eyes went to the shotgun, then back to my face. The other two men froze. My voice carried across the morning air. "You are trespassing. 60 seconds to leave. Only warning." Simmons raised his hand slightly, palms out. "Mr. Cole, we're executing a lawful seizure in accordance with HOA enforcement procedures. If you interfere, you'll be obstructing official action." There was something different in his voice today, an edge that had not been there during our first encounter. Desperation, perhaps, or the specific tension of a man who had promised his boss results and now faced the possibility of returning empty-handed. I wondered how deep Simmons was buried in Lawson's operation, how much he stood to lose if it collapsed. I did not move, did not raise the barrel. "You have no authority here. 50 seconds. The tow truck driver looked at Simmons, then at me, mid-50s, weathered face. He shook his head slowly. "Derek, I'm not getting shot over a repo that doesn't have proper paperwork. You told me this was authorized." Simmons turned sharply. "It is authorized. Just hook the vehicle." But his voice cracked on the last word, just slightly. The driver was already walking back to his cab. "I'm out. Find another company." He climbed in, started the engine, and backed down my driveway without looking back. Simmons watched him go. Something shifted in his posture. The confident enforcer was gone, replaced by a man watching his situation unravel. When he turned back to me, the mask of professionalism had slipped. "You just threatened us with a deadly weapon. I'm calling the police. You'll be arrested for assault." The words were aggressive, but his eyes kept darting to the road where the tow truck had disappeared. He was calculating escape routes, not attacks. I kept my voice steady. "Call them. I have security footage of everything that just happened." 30 seconds. And the younger man was already at the SUV's passenger door. Simmons hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw something unexpected. Fear, certainly, but also the particular panic of someone who had made promises he could not keep, who had assured Garrett Lawson that one stubborn landowner would not be a problem. He was not just afraid of me. He was afraid of going back to Ridgewood empty-handed for the second time. He backed toward the SUV, keeping his eyes on me until he reached the door. Then he climbed in and reversed down my driveway. The engine faded into the distance. I lowered the shotgun and walked inside to call Deputy Webb. He arrived within 40 minutes. I showed him the security footage on my laptop, the full sequence from approach to retreat. He watched without comment, taking notes. When the video ended, he looked at me with something close to respect. "You handled that exactly right. Weapon visible, but not aimed. Clear verbal warning. No threats." And he closed his notebook. "I'm filing a report. Criminal trespass, attempted theft. Combined with the other complaints, we might finally have enough for a formal investigation." He paused at the door. "This isn't the first time we've heard about Ridgewood problems, but you're the first person who's documented it properly." I walked him to his cruiser. "Deputy, how many complaints would it take to get the DA involved?" Webb considered the question. "Multiple victims with documented losses and physical evidence, that would do it." I nodded slowly. "Then I can help you with that." After Webb left, I sat on the porch with Duke at my feet. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold clarity. Simmons' behavior had revealed something important. He was not a true believer in Lawson's authority. He was an employee, someone paid to intimidate and collect. And he was scared, not just of confrontation, but of failing. That meant Lawson's operation depended on compliance, on victims who paid rather than fought, on the appearance of legitimate power. I had just proven that the power was an illusion. When challenged by someone who knew the law and was willing to stand their ground. The entire enforcement mechanism fell apart. A tow truck driver walked away. A compliance officer retreated in fear. The foundation of Lawson's scheme was crumbling, and I intended to bring down the rest of it. Word spread faster than I expected. Within 3 days of the tow truck incident, my phone started ringing with numbers I did not recognize. The first caller was Sandra Whitfield, who lived 2 miles north. She had heard about the confrontation from Margaret Dawson and wanted to know if someone had finally stood up to Ridgewood. When I confirmed the story, she told me her own. 18 months of harassment. $1,200 was paid before her daughter convinced her to stop. I was afraid to fight alone, she said. I'm not afraid anymore. By week's end, I had spoken with every victim in the area, the 8 I had already documented, plus 3 more who had never reported their experiences. 11 families spanning 4 years. Total losses now exceeded $31,000. The reactions varied. Some were angry, eager to join any legal action. Others were hesitant, worried about retaliation. Margaret Dawson, the widow who had started this chain of referrals, simply said, "Tell me what you need from me. I'll do it." I organized a meeting at my property for the following Saturday. 11 victims, plus Earl Thompson as a witness to the broader pattern. Attorney Morrison drove down from Austin. We gathered in my living room with documentation spread across every surface. Morrison listened to each person's account, taking notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When the final testimony concluded, he addressed the group. "What we have here is organized fraud," he said. "Theft by deception. Potentially racketeering. This is not aggressive enforcement. It's a criminal enterprise." He explained the path forward. Formal complaints to the county district attorney and the Texas Attorney General's office. Notification to the Texas Real Estate Commission regarding falsified boundaries. The legal system would move slowly, but it would move. He filed the complaints the following Monday. The DA acknowledged receipt and assigned an investigator. We were told to expect contact within 2 weeks. Then Diane Foster called. She identified herself as a member of the Ridgewood Estates HOA board. Her voice was nervous, uncertain. "Mr. Cole, I know you have no reason to trust anyone from Ridgewood, but I need to talk to you. What Garrett has been doing, I didn't know, not until recently, and I have information that might help." We met at a coffee shop in town. Diane was in her 50s, well-dressed, with the careful demeanor of someone accustomed to community politics. She had served on the board for 2 years, handling routine matters like landscaping contracts and maintenance schedules. She had believed Lawson when he talked about expanding influence to protect property values. She had not questioned the enforcement letters because she assumed they were legitimate. "I started asking questions after the tow truck incident," she said. "Some residents think you're dangerous, but others are wondering why Garrett sent a tow truck to someone's private land. I'm the board secretary. I have administrative access to the HOA email system for record-keeping purposes. I started looking through communications I'd never had reason to examine before." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folder. "I printed everything before Garrett realized I was looking. 17 pages of emails spanning 2 years. Most were routine business, but 3 exchanges were devastating. In the first, Lawson instructed Victoria Cross to send enforcement letters to properties he knew were outside the subdivision. "They won't check," he wrote. "Most don't have money for lawyers. Continue as normal." In the second, he discussed the survey marker tampering with someone identified only by initials, acknowledging that boundary adjustments were necessary to establish jurisdiction. The third was dated 2 weeks ago, after my cease and desist arrived. Lawson wrote, "The Cole situation is getting complicated. Move on the vehicle seizure before he involves the authorities. Make it look routine." I photographed every page. Diane agreed to provide a sworn statement confirming where she had obtained the documents. She was risking her position, possibly facing retaliation. I asked why. "Because what he's doing is wrong," she said simply. "I wanted to live in a community with standards. not one run by a thief. 3 days later, Lawson launched his counterattack. An email went out to every Ridgewood resident, warning them about the dangerous individual on adjacent property who had threatened HOA staff with a firearm during a routine compliance visit. The message painted me as unstable and aggressive. It urged residents to avoid my property and report suspicious activity. The intent was clear: preempt any narrative that portrayed him as the aggressor. I did not respond publicly. Morrison advised against engaging in accusation warfare. Let Lawson talk. The evidence would speak louder than emails. But I did take one action. Ridgewood's annual meeting was scheduled for the following month, according to their bylaws. Any individual materially affected by HOA actions could address the board during the open forum. I drafted a formal request, citing the enforcement letters, the attempted seizure, and the pattern affecting multiple landowners. Lawson could not deny the request without violating his own governing documents. His response came within 48 hours. Approved. 15 minutes to address the residents. 15 minutes to present evidence that their president was a fraud. Lawson thought he was granting me enough rope to hang myself in front of his supporters. He had no idea I intended to hang him instead. The week before the meeting, I organized my presentation with Morrison's guidance. The county survey confirms my property boundaries. Hartley's report documenting the moved stakes. Financial records showing payments to Lawson personally. Diane's emails prove he knew the scheme was illegal. Sworn statements from 11 victims. Every piece of evidence was copied, organized, and ready for distribution. Earl stopped by the night before. We sat on the porch in the cooling evening air. "You nervous?" he asked. I considered the question honestly. "No. I've briefed generals in combat zones, addressed rooms full of officers who could end careers with a word. A suburban HOA meeting is not going to rattle me." Earl nodded slowly. "Just remember, some of those people still believe in Lawson. They've been his neighbors for years. You're not just presenting evidence. You're asking them to accept that someone they trusted has been lying to them all along. That's harder than you might think." I understood what he meant. Facts alone would not be enough. I needed to make them see what Lawson really was, and I needed to do it in a way that left no room for doubt. The Ridgewood Estates Community Center was fluorescent-lit institutional blandness. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table where the board sat in positions of authority. Garrett Lawson occupied the center seat, flanked by Victoria Cross and 2 other members. Derek Simmons stood near the back door, watching the crowd filter in. By 7 o'clock, over 80 residents had filled the room. Word had spread about the confrontation at my property. They came to see what would happen next. I sat in the 3rd row with Earl beside me and a folder of documents on my lap. Morrison had advised against attending in person. I had overruled him. This was not a legal proceeding. This was theater, and the theater required presence. The first hour was routine business: budget reports, maintenance updates, a fence dispute that generated more passion than it deserved. I watched the room, identifying who seemed loyal to Lawson and who appeared uncertain. The ratio was roughly even. These people had trusted their leadership for years. They were about to learn otherwise. Lawson called the open forum at 8:15. 3 residents spoke before me. Then he looked at me with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Mr. Nathan Cole has requested time to address the board. You have 15 minutes. I walked to the front. The silence was absolute. I placed my folder on the podium. "My name is Nathan Cole. I own 40 acres adjacent to this subdivision. I have never been a member of Ridgewood Estates. My property has no recorded covenants connecting it to your HOA. Despite this, I have received enforcement letters, been assessed $1,500 in fines, and 2 weeks ago, 3 men entered my property with a tow truck to seize my vehicle. They were acting on orders from the man sitting in front of you." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Lawson's smile remained fixed. I continued. I am not the only victim. 11 landowners outside this subdivision have been targeted over 4 years. Total losses exceed $31,000. I held up the first documents. Canceled checks from 8 victims, all payable to Garrett Lawson individually, not to the HOA fund, to his personal account. The murmurs grew louder. Lawson stood abruptly. "This is slander. Mr. Cole threatened my staff with a firearm. Nothing he says should be taken seriously." I kept my voice level. "I have security footage of that incident. 3 men entered my property without permission. I asked them to leave. They left. Deputy Marcus Webb reviewed the footage and confirmed I acted within my legal rights." I looked directly at Lawson. "Would you like me to play the video?" He did not respond. I continued. "Your president has also been tampering with official survey markers. A licensed surveyor documented that boundary stakes on my property were moved 15 feet to create false jurisdiction claims. In Texas, that is a 3rd-degree felony." The room was buzzing now. I pulled another document. "These are internal emails from your HOA's administrative system, obtained by a board member with authorized access. In one, Mr. Lawson instructs Victoria Cross to send enforcement letters to properties he knows are outside the subdivision. His words, 'They won't check. Most don't have money for lawyers.' In another, he discusses the survey tampering as necessary to establish jurisdiction. A third, dated 2 weeks ago, orders the vehicle seizure at my property before I could involve authorities." Victoria Cross stood suddenly, face pale. "Those emails were obtained illegally." I looked at her calmly. "Ms. Cross, you're identified in these documents as legal counsel, but according to the Texas State Bar, you hold no law license. You've never passed the bar exam. You're not authorized to practice law in this state." The room erupted. Cross sat down hard. Lawson was shouting about defamation, but his voice was lost in the chaos. Near the back, Derek Simmons quietly slipped through the door and disappeared. He knew what was coming. A woman in the middle section stood, Diane Foster. Her voice cut through the noise. "I'm on this board. I obtained those emails from the HOA administrative system. As board secretary, I have authorized access for record-keeping purposes. I printed them myself. They're authentic, and I'm prepared to testify to that in court." Silence. All eyes turned to Lawson. His face had gone white. The confident president was gone, replaced by a man watching everything collapse. He pointed a shaking finger at Diane. "You're finished. I'll sue you for breach of fiduciary duty." "You're welcome to try," Diane said quietly. "But I think you'll have more pressing concerns." The back door opened. 2 county deputies entered. Deputy Webb, accompanied by a plainclothes investigator. They did not approach the front. They simply stood near the entrance, observing. Their presence was a message enough. Lawson saw them and understood. The investigation had begun. The complaints Morrison filed had triggered official action. These deputies were here to watch, to document, to gather evidence. Everything Lawson said from this moment could be used against him. He seemed to shrink. The room waited. I gathered my documents and returned to my seat. The evidence spoke for itself. The meeting adjourned 12 minutes later. Residents filed out in clusters, talking in urgent whispers. Several people approached to shake my hand, to thank me. One woman, whose elderly mother had paid nearly $4,000 in fraudulent fines, had tears in her eyes. "We didn't know," she said. "We trusted him." Lawson remained at the board table, staring at nothing. The deputies took notes near the door. Victoria Cross had not moved from her chair, seemingly paralyzed by the public exposure. Only one board seat sat empty. Simmons was gone, probably already planning how to distance himself from what was coming. Earl walked beside me to the parking lot. The night air was cool after the stuffy community center. "That was something," he said. I nodded slowly. "It's not over," but the foundation just cracked. We drove home in silence, the Texas sky vast and clear above us. I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Lawson had spent years building his scheme on silence and fear. He had counted on victims who would not fight, who would not research, who would not connect. He had targeted the isolated and the vulnerable. Tonight, silence had been shattered in front of 80 witnesses and 2 deputies. Tomorrow, the formal legal process will begin. But the real victory had already been won. Everyone in that room now knew the truth. And truth, once spoken publicly, cannot be unspoken. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. The combination of multiple victims, overwhelming physical evidence, and 2 cooperating witnesses accelerated what would normally be a months-long process into weeks. Within 72 hours of the HOA meeting, the county district attorney assigned a dedicated prosecutor. Within a week, the Texas Attorney General's office joined. Citing the scale of the operation, a forensic accountant was brought in to trace the money. What she found was worse than any of us had imagined. The $31,000 taken from external landowners was only part of the story. Lawson had also been draining the HOA itself. Dues payments meant for community maintenance flowed into shell accounts. Contractors were overbilled, with the difference pocketed. Reserve funds had been steadily siphoned for 3 years. The total exceeded $70,000. Ridgewood residents had been victimized alongside us. They simply had not known it. Derek Simmons was the first to fall. Deputies arrested him at a gas station near the Oklahoma border, 3 days after he fled the meeting. He was driving a rental car paid with cash, carrying a bag packed for extended travel, facing potential prison time. Simmons chose to cooperate immediately. His attorney negotiated a deal full testimony in exchange for reduced charges and probation. The investigator told me Simmons talked for 6 hours straight, describing every enforcement action, every property invaded, every payment collected on Lawson's orders. He named dates, amounts, and victims. He confirmed the survey marker tampering. He provided the roadmap prosecutors needed. Victoria Cross was arrested at her home the following week. Unlike Simmons, she initially refused to cooperate. Her attorney argued she had merely followed instructions without understanding the full scope. That defense collapsed when prosecutors presented the emails showing her active participation in targeting vulnerable landowners. Facing years in prison, she eventually agreed to testify against Lawson. Her plea deal limited the sentence to 18 months of probation. Garrett Lawson was arrested on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the HOA meeting. I was not present, but Deputy Webb called me afterward. 6 officers arrived at 7 in the morning. His wife answered the door in her bathrobe, confused and frightened. Lawson was led out in handcuffs while neighbors gathered on their lawns. The man who had spent years intimidating others was now the one being led away. The charges were comprehensive, everything from the falsified boundaries to the misappropriation of HOA funds. The prosecutor told reporters it was one of the most extensive cases the county had seen. Bail was set at $100,000. Lawson could not pay. His assets were frozen, his hidden accounts now evidence. He remained in the county jail awaiting trial. His wife filed for divorce 2 weeks later. I testified at the preliminary hearing in early December. The courtroom was small and functional. Lawson sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, avoiding eye contact with anyone. I took the stand and answered questions for 45 minutes. The surveyor's report, the certified property records, the financial trail. Each piece built the prosecution's case higher. The defense attorney tried to challenge my credibility, suggesting I had orchestrated a vendetta out of personal animosity. I kept my voice steady. I responded to threats with legal process. I did not seek out Mr. Lawson. He targeted me when he sent men to steal my vehicle. I defended my property within the law. Every action I have taken has been in response to crimes committed against my neighbors and me. The judge ruled that sufficient evidence existed to proceed to trial. Lawson would face a jury on all charges. As I left the courtroom, I passed his wife sitting alone in the gallery. She did not look at me. Local news covered the story extensively. Headlines ran for days. I declined interview requests. Morrison handled media inquiries, focusing on the legal process rather than personal narratives. The story was not about me. It was about accountability. The other victims began receiving notifications about restitution proceedings. Once Lawson's assets were liquidated, payments would be distributed. Margaret Dawson called me the day her letter arrived. "I never thought I'd see that money again," she said, her voice breaking. "I never thought anyone would believe us." I told her the system worked when people stood together. She had been willing to stand. They all had. Diane Foster was elected interim HOA president by emergency board vote. Her first act was commissioning an independent audit of all finances. Her second was sending a formal apology to every landowner who had been targeted. The letter acknowledged the HOA's failure to oversee its leadership, promised full cooperation with legal proceedings, and offered to cover legal fees incurred by victims during their defense. It was a small gesture, but it signaled genuine change. The trial was scheduled for March. Prosecutors expected it to last 2 weeks, with Simmons and Cross both testifying for the state, and the mountain of records supporting every charge. Conviction seemed certain. Lawson's attorney had reportedly approached the prosecutor about a plea deal, but the offer was rejected. The DA wanted a trial. He wanted the full scope of Lawson's crimes entered into the public record. A warning to anyone else who might try to exploit their position. Earl stopped by the evening after the preliminary hearing. We sat on my porch in the cold December air, watching stars emerge over the fields. Duke lay between us, content. "You did something important," Earl said quietly. "Not just for yourself, for everyone he would have targeted next." I thought about Margaret and Robert, about Sandra Whitfield, about the Ridgewood residents who had trusted their president and been betrayed. "I just told the truth and refused to back down," I said. "The system did the rest." Earl nodded slowly. "Sometimes that's enough. Someone willing to tell the truth and not back down." We sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around us. Somewhere in a county jail cell, Garrett Lawson was learning what happened when he chose the wrong target. And somewhere in the distance, the land stretched out, quiet and unbothered, indifferent to the small human dramas played out on its surface. The trial lasted 9 days. I attended every session, sitting in the gallery with Earl and several other victims. Prosecutors methodically dismantled what remained of Garrett Lawson's defenses. Simmons described 3 years of fraudulent enforcement in clinical detail. Cross confirmed her role, voice barely above a whisper. But the moment that ended, everything came when the prosecution displayed Lawson's own words on the courtroom screen. "They won't check. Most don't have money for lawyers." The jury watched. Lawson stared at the table. No defense could survive that. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon. Guilty on all counts. Lawson showed no reaction as the foreman read each decision. He simply sat motionless, a man who had finally run out of angles. Sentencing came the following month. The courtroom was packed. Margaret Dawson sat in the front row. Robert Keller was there, along with Sandra Whitfield and most of the other victims. Diane Foster represented Ridgewood, present to witness the closure. The judge reviewed the pattern of victimization, the abuse of trust, and the deliberate targeting of vulnerable individuals. Then she delivered the sentence: 5 years in state prison. Full restitution of $70,000. 3 years of supervised probation following release. Permanent prohibition from any position of authority in community organizations. Lawson was led away in handcuffs, His wife was not present. Neither were there any friends. He disappeared through a side door into a future very different from the one he had imagined. Simmons received 2 years probation and community service. Cross received 18 months probation and was barred from ever presenting herself as legal counsel. Both would carry the weight of their choices for the rest of their lives. The restitution checks arrived over the following weeks. Margaret called me the day hers came. "It's not just the money," she said. "It's knowing that what happened to me mattered." I told her she had mattered from the moment she agreed to testify. We all had. Spring came early that year. I walked my property line on a warm March morning, Duke trotting beside me. The boundary markers stood in their correct positions, properly documented with the county. My 40 acres were exactly what they had always been mine. Diane Foster stopped by one afternoon. She had been elected permanent HOA president in January, running unopposed. Under her leadership, Ridgewood had adopted new bylaws, annual independent audits, term limits, and strict prohibitions on enforcement actions against non-member properties. She handed me a formal apology letter from the reconstituted board and shook my hand. "We're trying to build something better," she said. I told her that was all anyone could ask. Earl and Betty came for dinner that weekend. We sat on my porch as the sun dropped toward the horizon. Betty brought pie. Earl brought the whiskey he had been saving. We talked about the trial, about the changes in Ridgewood, about the strange way justice sometimes required ordinary people to act before the system would pay attention. "You could have walked away," Earl said, "paid the fines, avoided the trouble. Most people would have." I considered the observation. Maybe, but some things are worth defending, not because they're valuable to anyone else, but because they're yours, because you earned them, because letting someone take them without a fight means losing something you never get back. Duke lifted his head, ears pricked toward the eastern tree line, but there was nothing there now. No watchers, no threats, just quiet land stretching toward the horizon. I raised my glass to the empty field, to Earl and Betty, to Margaret and Robert and Sandra and all the others who had been willing to stand, to Diane, who had chosen truth over loyalty. The no trespassing sign still stood at my property entrance, but they felt different now, not warnings against future threats, simple statements of fact. The sun disappeared below the horizon. Stars emerged. Duke settled at my feet with a contented sigh. Earl poured another round. And somewhere in a state prison cell, Garrett Lawson was beginning the first night of the next 5 years. I had survived 2 combat tours. I had built a life on land I earned. I had defended that land against men who thought power made them untouchable. Not through violence, not through anger, through patience, preparation, and the simple refusal to back down. Some lessons take years to learn. Some take only a single confrontation with someone who will not be intimidated. The night deepened around us, vast and quiet, Texas sky above, solid ground below, peace. Finally, after months of conflict, I had not asked for this fight, but when it came, I had been ready. And I would be ready again if I ever needed to be. That was the lesson Garrett Lawson had failed to understand. Some boundaries are not negotiable, some people do not fold, and some land belongs to those who are willing to defend it.